Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey. She's Juliana Osborne, and this is Inside Exec. Today we've got a very different subject matter expert to talk to. That's Aaron Dozier, and Aaron is an exercise physiologist. Got it right in one. I didn't stumble over the words. Aaron is an Australian-trained exercise physiologist with a passion for human movement and performance, rehabilitation, and all things health and well-being. Now, as you know, in the past, we've talked to a number of experts about mental health and mental well-being. We've talked about holistic approaches to your work-life balance. And so Aaron today is going to look at it from a different perspective for us in terms of exercise and exercise physiology. And Juliana's going to get very involved in the discussion.
I'm laughing, but it's not going to happen.
No, this is so good for our listeners to hear that every now and then I can stop her in her tracks and not have any conversation. But all that aside, welcome, Aaron. It is lovely to have you and to meet you.
And thank you so much for taking the time and having me on.
The first question we asked, in terms of what you do, it's obviously a broad range of exercise work in terms of rehabilitation, but have the services that you offer changed in the last 5 years? And we chose 5 years particularly because we've had a period of time where people were more open to doing things for themselves than they might have been previously. They made time for it, shall we say.
Yeah. I saw this as the first question. It's actually quite interesting because 5 years ago, I was actually in El Chalten in the Patagonia region in Argentina. So I wasn't working at all. I was actually on a sabbatical. So yeah, I think in the last 5 years, it's changed dramatically. Before that, I was working in Texas though. So I spent about a decade working in Texas, working for a company that specialized in the applied integration for the rapid recovery of soft tissue injuries. So we were working with everyone from office workers to a lot of the professional sporting teams over there, working essentially to get people back very quickly, back on the field, back to life, back to whatever they like to do. After the sabbatical and wandering around South America for about 6 months, I moved back home where I grew up on the Atherton Tablelands. In the last 5 years, I've started out the business here on kind of as a sole trader and working my own thing. So from going from that very narrow kind of focus of just focusing on soft tissue injuries to now having my scope a lot broader. Obviously, when you're in private practice and in business, you kind of tend to take in a lot more different stuff. So at the moment, we kind of do everything from a lot of work with kids within the NDIS scheme, so the National Disability Insurance Scheme, to DVA, to Medicare, and then just the private people coming in. So that's very much the clinical side of the business, which is working on exercise prescription for acute or chronic diseases or injuries and stuff like that. And then on the side of that, I have a training platform. So I spent a long time also working in strength and conditioning gyms and different things like that. So the training platform is a little more outlet for the athletic side of it, less of the clinical side of it. I have a tennis prodigy on there. I have a couple Muay Thai fighters, some triathletes, some CrossFit athletes, just a very different mix of kind of athletes on there. So it's a nice little balance. I get a good little bit of very clinical, very hands-on, and then I get a good little bit of just training athletes and stuff like that too. So over the last 5 years, I was thinking about this. I've just kind of been in business for right on about 5 years now, maybe a little bit less. So
across that board, across that really wide range of services and of clientele, is there one defining feature that helps people be successful in their recovery, in their approach to what they're doing?
Absolutely. I think the thing that you'll see, which from the athletes themselves and then onto the clinical rehab patients, I think the thing that generally sets the ones that are very successful apart from the ones that aren't is generally compliance, just continuing to show up and continuing to work at it. So within an exercise program, they're all flawed in some way. Rehab is always a little bit of guesswork. It's always a little bit flawed in itself, but the person that continually works at it will generally do enough to kind of overshadow or overwork those little shortcomings in the long run if they just continually stick at it. I generally see two types of people. I see the ones that I need to push along a lot and try to get them to do anything. And then you have the other end is the person that does a whole lot and just generally like needs pulling back and reining in to a degree. But the person that needs the reining in is always trying and always pushing. Generally, they have a lot better outcomes. If I could give all of my patients one thing, I think it'd just be a bit of resilience and a bit of kind of discipline to push and continue on.
just as you were saying that, I wondered whether you had the ones at the other end of the scale that push themselves, whether it's the athletes that need to get back for a competition, or they financially they need to get back to where they're earning money, and that is across the board, not just the athletes. But is there a group of people who can do too much and then do more damage?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot, particularly in the rehab field, because essentially all exercise in a sense is therapeutic. All exercise in a sense is damaging too. So it's a lot about finding that line. And we often say that the dose makes the poison. So sometimes if you're trying to load a tendon injury or a muscle injury, or you're trying to get someone back from, say, a cardiac event or something like that, getting the dosing right and this kind of graded exposure and gradual loading is very important to that. So at one point, you might have a situation where, hey, this exercise is fantastic for them. It does really good. But 3 weeks or 3 months before that point, that exercise might have been very exacerbating or very damaging. So often, I mean, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but the runners are very hard because they're always wanting to run, and they're like, I'm torn the hamstring off the bone. And they're like, I'm just going to run through it. And we're like, oh, you can't do that. Like, you need to take some time and you need to get that to settle on down. So yeah, the dose really does matter. It's probably the most integral part. When you're gaining fitness too much fitness or too much just hard work is unrecoverable in a sense as well. So you can do too much to where the body's not recovering and kind of getting along from there. So I think people view fitness, particularly in that sense, as something that's forced or pushed, or really you just like hard will it into happening, when it's much more of just nuancing the right amounts of levels, the right loads, the right intensities, and that kind of thing along the way. Yeah, like I said, a lot of the time it's pulling people back. A lot of the time it's pushing them along. It's trying to get them to that middle point.
I'll just remind our listeners that that's an indication of one of the guests that we had very early on, who was a triathlete, a professional triathlete. And he came to us, Josh came to us and talked to us for a while about the discipline around training, and he had his own business at the time, work-life balance. And when he came to us, he'd just done a triathlon the weekend before, and he couldn't put on any shoes because his toes were all bruised and messed up. And he said to us at this stage, he was sitting there injured and the rest of it, and he said, I don't think I'll do triathlon stuff anymore. And we thought, well, that's probably a good idea, have a rest. He said, I'm going to take up ultra marathons.
It was kind of just selling one for the other there, wasn't he? Ultra marathons,
which he did, and he did well at them, but it was just beyond us why you would put your body through that.
Well, I'm not sure if you're paying any attention to it, but there's currently Ned Brockman. So Ned was the Australian guy. He ran from Perth to Sydney, which is an incredible feat across the country. And he tried to break the world record for that in 44 days. And he kind of just fell short of that, but it was an incredible achievement nonetheless to run all the way. And now he's on his new challenge where he's trying to break the world record for, I think, 10,000 miles. Right. So he's running about 160 kilometers a day around a 400-meter track. You kind of see him and his toes are kind of all blistered and sore in his knees. And there's obviously a point when it becomes more mental than it is physical. And I think people miss this point with fitness a little bit too. We view, and I think us as an industry have done a little bit of a bad job of this, but we've promoted this. It's all rah, super hard, Navy SEAL training, right? Go. When a lot of it can be a lot more nuanced and a lot more easy, and it's kind of gentle, and you'll get a lot of the benefits that you would normally get from that without having to go to the extremes. Now, there is a subset that just really like that. Obviously, I think you said it was Josh that you talked to as one of those where he just enjoys it and that's the way he wants to do it, and that's totally fine. But when we look at kind of the research of it too, if we take someone that isn't particularly doing much physical activity at all, so they're quite sedentary, so we compare them to, say, a Tour de France rider. So a Tour de France rider is obviously pushing the absolute line of what's possible in terms of what we call like VO2 max, which is how much oxygen you can use and kind of the physicality of all that. So they're elite trained athletes with a huge amount of volume going on. So if we can take that person that's not doing anything though, and then we can compare them to the Tour de France rider, there's about a 6 times decrease in all-cause mortality. So across all the broad spectrum of things that might catch up with you and over time with your health, there's about 6 less than that. So that's quite dramatic. But if we take someone that's in that sedentary category and we don't move them all the way to kind of that end point of this very elite athlete, we just move them into the middle third. which is quite reasonable to do. There's not a huge change there, but that person will decrease their all-cause mortality by 5 times. So they're getting just about all of that benefit with dramatically less work, dramatically less time. They don't need professional sponsorships. They don't need to wreck their body in a sense to do it. So a lot of the benefits are available to everyone. I think, like I said, we've just done a bad job of selling it as like it has to be really hard and it has to be difficult and you've got to be super disciplined. When really a couple times a week you could find something you enjoy and do it to a moderate level and still get a whole lot of those benefits. So.
That then triggers the question for me of, okay, so we'll do it a couple of times a week. Is the discipline about having specific times and a specific amount of time and a specific thing that you do? Or is it about understanding that you need to do it a couple of times a week? It's just got to be fitted into the great scheme of things. And that what happens if you miss out for whatever reason, do you do twice as much the next week?
Definitely not. That's generally a pretty good recipe and a pretty way to either burn yourself out or get injured and we see it a lot too. People will set themselves up and decide like, okay, I'm going to do, well, I call this one the New Year's Day fallacy, where they wake on up and they're like, well, first of all, I'm never drinking again because I'm hungover. And then this was the year I said I'd get fit. So I'm going to run 7 times a week. And then I'm going to go to boot camp 9 times a week and yoga 7 times a week. And after a little bit, they realize that's really unsustainable and really not enjoyable. They can't keep up with it. They don't like it. And they end up falling off and kind of going from there. Whereas if they just set it up and said, I'm going to walk most days and then 3 times a week, I'll go play tennis that I enjoy, or I'll find some time to do a little bit of gym work that I enjoy. And they in a much more sustainable approach kind of built those habits over the long term. Then that have a lot more success with that. So rather than, I think people do get into that thinking of like, oh God, I missed this, I have to cram it all in from there. But if you look into the maintenance loads, as we call them, for physical activity, they're relatively low. So you can maintain the majority of your lean muscle mass with about working out once a week at about 40%. So it's quite resilient. It'll hang around. So if you miss a couple of days here and then you're a little more consistent for a few weeks, you won't lose much at all. Same with fitness. Top-end fitness, that really kind of top-end sprinting capacity in real fitness, it drops off a little bit quicker. It's more of an enzyme thing and it's quite expensive to maintain, so the body's a little more reluctant to keep it around, but you'll maintain a lot of your fitness with just a little input. So I think people view it a lot as I have to go really hard and get it all in and I got to do it every single week and for this time, but a lot more it's about sustainable and consistent habits and patterns that are occurring, rather than for 3 days and 3 weeks, for 3 months, 3 years, and so on and so forth.
I think too that we're talking to a demographic within the podcast of people who are used to measuring results.
Yep.
So if we're talking about someone who is very sedentary, has been for, let's say 10 years, they've been quite sedentary while they've developed their career and they're at a point now where they're comfortable, they're in the right position, but they know that they should be doing more about their physical health for a longer life, whatever reason it is.
Yep.
They listen to you and they say, okay, well, I can just do it nice and easy and I'll just do a couple of things. Maybe I'll just have some weights in the office and when I'm talking on the phone, I've got the earpiece in, I'll use the weights, whatever it is. How do they measure the improvement that's making?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of measuring the improvement with weightlifting is generally just measured in a load sense or a rep sense, which is pretty easy to do. So say I could do this exercise for 10 reps last week, and then in a couple of weeks, I can do it for 12. That's a very easy progress to measure. The biggest one with that we usually start to measure is some kind of low level activity. So we call that one NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is a very fancy way to essentially say walking. But it's kind of just that very low level movement we do throughout the day, which if you think about the human, we're really designed to be very on our feet, very moving, kind of cruising around. A lot of the gym is essentially our attempt of modern society to encapsulate this human movement because we don't get it as much as we used to. So the first place we generally start with people that are coming in and they're in that kind of situation is we look at getting a step count for them generally.
Yep.
So, okay, you're taking around 3,500 steps a day. Can we just move that up to 4,000 steps? And can we slowly kind of tick away at building that habit in there? And that's one of the healthiest routines you can have. The research on how healthy steps are for you and that movement is dramatic. It's the primary measure for how we kind of go about with weight maintenance. It's the most important part that we get on there. Everyone thinks that that's this intense kind of exercise idea again, but actually walking is the thing that's going to change the most there. So a step count is usually the very easiest way we go from there. And then rather than directly trying to measure, say, the load of the resistance training or anything like that, we usually set them up with a compliance goal to begin with. So say, hey, can we just stick at this compliance for 2 times a week when you have time in the office? Can we get that in there? And then we go through a strategy we call NEAT up, which is just ways to increase NEAT. Like, do you take a coffee in the morning? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, cool. Walk when you drink the coffee. Can you walk to the meeting instead of emailing someone? Can you walk over there? When you duck out for lunch, can you park a little further away? Like, can you take the dog for a walk? Just very simple strategies to try building a little bit movement around there. So that way we do have some metrics, and it can go either way. Metrics can be something that people really like and enjoy, and they go through this process of what we call gamifying it. Yep. Whether it becomes a game for them, I must get the steps in, I need to get that in. And some people are really good at that. It can become obsessive, and it can become a problem for other people too. So sometimes you want to lean away from the metrics a little bit as well. So particularly I have a few at the moment that are young females with eating disorders that we're working through. So with them, it's very much trying to get away from the metrics. They're constantly trying to quantify food or volume or energy expenditure. So depending on who comes in, you kind of have to get a feel for what the right strategy is, which way you can push them, how you can motivate and get them going from there. But if I had someone that came in very sedentary and they're like, I know I need to do something, what can I measure? I would go steps straight away, and then I'd have a compliance goal for doing just a little bit of resistance work throughout the week.
Yeah. We're taking a break now in our discussion with Aaron Dozier about wellness and maintaining a healthy attitude towards work and life. I'm Kim Bailey, she's Juliana Osborne. Join us for part 2, but for now, this is Inside Exec.